top of the show, top of the hour. Here we are. So I want to welcome everybody to our live chat following the episode of the Laura Flanders Show this week that really introduces some new colleagues and colleagues you're going to be seeing a lot more of on our airwaves. It's always a surprise to me to remember that even as we're watching on YouTube, we're also going out to public television stations all across the country. And as our podcast producer reminds me, also on radio all across the country. This live chat will be posted at YouTube after the fact and also on Facebook at the Laura Flanders Show Facebook page. It's there for the reposting and sharing, so please do it. And I want to thank everybody from URL Media who joined us in the premiere watch and will be joining us all week, as well, of course, as the wonderful leaders of the network that we have with us in this chat. Mitra, Sarah, Sunday morning on top of the broadcast is a big ask, but I thank you. And Sierra, same thing. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our chance for other guests, other viewers in addition to myself, to pose some questions. But first, I just wanted to ask how you were all feeling. We actually recorded all of that before the Derek Chauvin trial verdict. It was an amazing week, interesting. I saw one person describe my feelings, well, not me, obviously, but someone else, who said that she felt the relief that comes of having held a lot of tension, but not the relief that comes from something being solved. I don't know how it was for you, but who wants to kick off? Mitra.
Oh, goodness. Well, I think it's worth acknowledging that it was historic. And Laura, we're trying to do things differently. One annoyance I had with the immediate framing of the verdict was sort of this like sigh of relief of, oh, things will be calm now. And for me, that felt quite insulting because it felt like you're leapfrogging beyond this historic moment. This is the first time that a white police officer in Minnesota has been convicted for the death of a Black person on duty, right? Now, that is historic. And so I wish that there had been a little bit more diving into the history of this instead of the, oh, we're so relieved that there won't be riots and protests tonight. People were gearing up for this. Like it was a little bit the framing of that from a white-led media, as we've been talking about in the episode that we just aired, was disconcerting. So I'm clinging to the history of the moment still.
Yeah. What about you, Sarah? And I'm giving up leadership. Everybody talk. You don't need me to talk.
Yeah, I think my immediate reflection was about how organizing made this possible. I think I tweeted this, but just, it's not, a lot of folks were texting me or reaching out just saying how surprised they were about the verdict. And, I wasn't as surprised because when abolition is on the table, when you're talking about defunding the police, when you're talking about getting rid of all police officers, like convicting one police officer just doesn't feel as radical anymore. And so I think what we've seen is like a shift in the status quo in what is acceptable. And the more that organizers continue to push us, I think we will continue to see more and more accountability.
Sarah?
Yeah, and I think that some of it is being processed through a generational lens, because I think that for older Black people in particular who have, memories of Emmett Till and have memories definitely of Rodney King and some of the blatant exonerations that white police officers have had, historically. And so this feels there's a certain degree of a sense of justice, possibly for one of the first times working to the benefit of Black people, but at the same time, recognizing like literally almost at the exact time that the Chauvin verdict was being rendered, a 16-year-old Black girl was shot and killed in Ohio. And, so very different circumstances. All of these things are different But the relentlessness, the persistence, the fact that this is so chronic and recurring in America in terms of Black bodies is what is so infuriating and frightening and disheartening. But at the same time, I also think that the way that the prosecution formulated their case was also historic. And I think that we're going to be unpacking all of this stuff in terms of the Chauvin trial, the verdict, all of this for many, many weeks, months, years to come.
Yeah, I mean,
hopefully there's a playbook that can be used.
I mean, Sierra, you made the point, but I had to observe as I was watching that prosecution. I don't think you would have seen the members of the police department disavowing Chauvin if it hadn't been for the movement outside saying defund the police, the institution, that we have an institutional problem. So that was huge. Since we recorded the show, a lot of people who've seen the pre-edits and stuff have asked me, would you ask Sierra to define movement journalism one more time? And I know this is something you're asked to do a lot. And for those of us who feel we were always born in movement journalism, it's hard to remember it's like a big thing. But how about it? How do you define it? And maybe you, Mitra, could weigh in, because you certainly have been part of other movement journalisms, meaning CNN, Fortune, and all the rest. Sierra.
Yeah, so movement journalism is defined as journalism in service of justice and liberation. Though the folks that I work with, namely at Scalawag and also at our sister organization Press On, are very clear about the fact that we don't want to own the definition of movement journalism. One, there are people who've been doing it for a very long time, way before, frankly, any of us were alive. But two, because it is grassroots in nature, because it is like something that belongs with and to the people, we don't want to just label it or say like this is the rigid definition, but that is how we generally talk about it.
Am I right in thinking it came out of that very good report commissioned by Project South?
Yes,
around movement journalism, Anna Simonton's report?
Yeah, so the Out of Struggle report, which was commissioned by Project South, Anna Simonton, who used to work at Scalawag as an editor, but was also working with Project South at the time. They did a whole report on the South and movement-driven journalism, both, reporting within newsrooms, but also radio stations, and just really across the spectrum, and what they were seeing as the potential for journalism to work more closely with community.
So I would add that I spent most of my career in mainstream media, as we've just outlined, and for much of that existence, it felt like in order to practice the type of journalism that Sierra is talking about, we always needed like an extra word, right? So there was journalism in the newsroom, and then there could be movement journalism, which is relatively new for me, but some other words that we've heard are advocacy journalism, service journalism, solutions journalism, sometimes community journalism. And I have to confess that for my whole career, I've always had great discomfort with those terms because it implies that the fundamental part of just journalism doesn't include being in service to your audiences, being in community with your audiences, advocating for your audiences, right? So it's just interesting that in the last 5 or 10 years, maybe longer, that our newsrooms have really grappled with their economic models, with technology and what their role should be, and the era of Facebook and Twitter. I don't see it as a coincidence that journalism is struggling with those things as movements like movement journalism and Scalawag and Word and Epicenter, my outlet, are embraced by our communities and kind of taking off, if you will, right? And so another way to think about it is that we are redefining journalism. And I also think that in some ways the pandemic has really forced every newsroom to look at what is the utility, what is the service we're offering to people in times of life or death. I'll mention, Epicenter, my outlet, we've been helping New Yorkers secure appointments for vaccines. And I cannot tell you the number of people who've asked me, is that journalism? Are you more of an advocate? Is like something I would never have expected, because for us, it's really meeting the community in a place of fundamental need, but also in some cases, especially helping immigrants secure documentation and get to their appointments, we're just trying to prove their humanity. Literally, you are trying to go to New York State and say, I exist as a human being, I deserve my vaccine. If our role as journalists is not enabling someone to prove that they are human, and just to be clear, these are Black and brown people, then I really don't want to be a part of that journalism.
Also, it suggests that the New York Times, with its advertisements for Tiffany and penthouse brokers and, Morgan Stanley, is not also in service to a community, just a different community. Sorry, Sarah.
Yeah, Laura, I got to get in on this question, because I feel like Black media, Black owned media, since the first Black newspaper was started in 1827 by John B. Russwurm and Samuel Cornish, Freedom's Journal, we are movement journalism since because our very humanity was disavowed through slavery. And so Black media, whether it was the North Star by Frederick Douglass or the work that Ida B. Wells Barnett did with her anti-lynching journalism movement, we've always been, Black media, Black press, Black radio has always been about advocating, whether you call it advocacy, community, movement, whatever it is, it has always been about creating a space where we could tell our own stories from our own views and advocate for the full humanity of our lives. And so, WURD, my radio station in Philadelphia, we are following in that lineage, because we still, the fact that in 2014 or whenever, the launch of Black Lives Matter began, I am a man was what was in the 60s, the sign. We're still having to say, I am human. I matter. My life is real. And it needs to be protected. It needs to be valued. It needs to be celebrated. And so, I'm on panels all the time about trust in the media and things like that. And I'm with Mitra. It's like, I don't care really what you call me. I am the work that we do at Word, the work that we're doing with URL is about looking at what the needs are from the audience, from the community, and providing a way to bridge those gaps and to solve those challenges. It doesn't matter what the label is.
Right.
That's the work.
I used to bristle every time I was introduced as an advocacy journalist, until I finally said, and you think you're not?
Exactly.
Some questions in the chat. One of them from one of our beloved board members has to do with the functional size of a news organization going into the future. Is there a limit? Is that something that you think about if you're going to retain your connection with your community? Sierra.
Yeah, I think that it depends on the needs of the community. And I really hope that as more and more journalism startups come into existence, that's something that folks really begin to think about. Some communities will only need a one-person newsroom with a newsletter. Some communities will need a bigger newsroom with more staff and, multiple types of products to reach all people in their community. But I think we have created this sort of like vision of success within journalism for like, this is what it looks like to be a successful news organization. And if you are not hitting those marks, or if you don't look like that, then you're not sustainable, or, you're not considered a successful newsroom. So I think it really, just like everything else, should be rooted in what are the needs of the community, what are you trying to provide, and like how much staffing and what type of resources do you need to be able to do that.
Anyone else?
Well, I would just say that I think that for so long, and I'm speaking about Black owned media specifically right now, for so long, we've been starved for resources. And so when you are constantly having to prove that the community that you serve, the community that is engaged with you matters, Like, so if you start, that is Black Lives Matter. If the presumption from white America is that Black lives don't matter, you know, and let's be real, that is kind of the world we live in, then when you have a media organization that is centered around serving those lives, those communities, it is very difficult to access financial resources from, whether it's from corporate advertising or philanthropic support, or all of those things, because there's an assumption of less than. I think that that's changing. I think that with the protests and with all of these companies pledging additional resources to address anti-Black racism and systemic oppression, I think that, I mean, I've never seen a shift like this ever before in my life. And so I'm encouraged by that, but we also need to keep the pressure. We need to keep the accountability, because we know from history that it's, you know, like, there's a very short attention span when it comes to Black advocacy and empowerment. And so we have to stay engaged for sure.
I would just add one thing, which is that the size of our newsrooms is also being redefined, because I think all three of us, at least here, I know, have a pretty tight relationship with our communities. So where the newsroom begins and where the newsroom ends and where the community begins is a little bit more fluid than perhaps kind of the linear, like, I am covering the city council, I am covering this building, like the traditional beat coverage. I'll just give you a anecdote from this week at Epicenter. There was a 8-alarm fire in Jackson Heights, Queens, and the residents of that community approached us and said, you know, many of us are all over the city. We did not all get our vaccines. Could you help in that endeavor? And I said, of course, we'll move you to the front of the booking. So we started registering dozens of people who were hurt by the fire. Within a few hours, I get another list saying, these are some families who were displaced by the fire. One of them was a delivery person for a restaurant. He lost his bicycle. Their son had eyeglasses, like just a long list. And I said, oh, I could get you vaccines. I don't know about all of this. But I said, you know what, let me turn to our community. And so I put it out there. Within 2 hours, everything on that list had been taken care of by either a donor, another member of the community who said, I have someone who can connect them to this nonprofit. And so that is a very familiar way that we work. And that's not common from my career and how I've practiced journalism before this moment.
I mean, that's certainly familiar to me from my experience in community radio, whether it was WBAI or Pacifica more broadly, that sense of connection. It's not a feeling I had when I worked in radio at Air America, although Air America did Air America Radio, which launched in 2004 and was an effort to have a progressive wing of the Democratic Party alternative to right-wing talk. And I found that the difference was, and one of the failings or problems for Air America was that it failed to get advertising. And I started looking at, well, what was it going after? And it was going after these national advertising chains, because those were the people that advertised on talk radio. So that caused me to also think about the relationship between our community media and our community economies. You know, it's great that these huge corporations are putting some money behind racial justice, absolutely. But their practices in our communities could mean the difference between community business thriving or not. And those local community businesses are more likely, it seems to me, to be the ones that support our media. Now, our local media, none of this is easy to unravel, but it's complicated. And one of my goals in this programming is to connect the movement for, you know, diverse, sustainable local economics and local community business with, you know, community wealth building, they call it, with community media wealth building, and how do those relate? Because if we're just chasing after the national advertisers, we're going to be up against national media. It's really hard to support a local initiative. Sarah's saying pushback. Go for it. Pushback.
It's totally both end. You need the, you know, I know for us, we definitely see this symbiotic relationship. And I've always said the stronger WURD is, the stronger our community will be, the stronger our businesses will be. But, you know, there's also this vicious cycle. There's a huge racial wealth gap. We know in Philadelphia, you know, only about 2.5% of the businesses in Philadelphia are Black-owned businesses, which is horrific. It's terrible. But if you don't have a strong, business community that understands it, it's hard to, get the support. So as we seek to build that community economic power, we also need the corporations. It's really all hands on deck. It's both and there is value. I know Philadelphia is like the fifth, it's a major media market.
Yeah.
So most of these national corporations, they have a buy in Philadelphia. So, because they want to reach a big market like this. So you've got to work on all fronts in order to not just survive, but continue to grow as a community media organization.
Sierra, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think it's a very different reality being in the South, a very economically depressed region of the country, especially for Black folks. What I would say is like, we're also a nonprofit newsroom at Scalawag, and we don't take money from advertisers. And so, but we're still having a very parallel discussion, right? Thinking about our work with foundations and how a lot of, especially private foundations, their money comes from wealthy individuals who have at some point probably been a part of some type of extractive process that has, left this wealth gap that we're talking about. And so, we're always having a conversation around like, who are we partnering with philanthropically? How does that align with our values? But mostly thinking about, okay, like how are we using this money to get us where we want to be? Always with an eye toward looking back to our community to help support our work. So we're a membership-driven organization, and our ultimate goal is to be able to be funded by individual donors and members of Scalawag. But we also know that that's a long way off, and that because of the systems that exist, that it is hard for folks who don't have that disposable income to give. And so, yeah, it's a balancing act for sure.
Mitra?
Yeah, I think we are, to what you're describing, Laura, I think we are in a moment where we want to push business to do the right thing by advertising with outlets like ours. The number of times that for Epicenter, we've been called a mutual aid organization or a nonprofit just makes me laugh, because we're a for-profit media company, but it sounds like in order to do good, the mind instantly goes to they must be a nonprofit, or they must be mutual aid, or they're a community organization. And we want to support businesses that are doing the right thing by their communities, but also their customers. Right. And I don't think there's any shame in that. So I think there is an evolution of the advertising model as it sort of stands in this very, it's obviously transactional, but could you, have government advertising, for example, support these types of businesses in a bigger way? We're all familiar with different rates for different types of businesses. So I think that is where we're moving. I do think the way that I loosely frame businesses, both for URL Media as well as for Epicenter, is yes, there's a need for advertising. Yes, there's a need for membership and community in a very inclusive sense, as Sierra just said. And then there's, of course, a role for philanthropy, because there's some aspects of coverage or of services that we want to be able to provide specifically to our communities that philanthropy that is very well set up to support.
And we will take all support that we can.
That's right.
We're a nonprofit and we don't run ads, but in an extractive economy, our entire economy is extractive on one level or another. So everyone makes their own decisions about how they survive. I will say it is going to be very exciting to me to see how your conversations play out in the months to come here on the show. And I think that we can be mutual aid and self-supporting in new and creative ways. We certainly hope. I feel like I'm in a mutual aid little grouping here. And look how quickly we go from what stories we're covering to how the hell are we paying the bills. Gives you a sense of what we all deal with. To close, I don't want to keep you longer on your Sunday morning, but what stories are you excited about, things coming up, pieces you're reporting on, shows you're having? How can people hook up with URL Media? They can obviously go to our website and they'll find links to all of your groups, and they're all linked here in the YouTube post. But what can people do and what will they find if they come to your outlets this week? Who wants to go first? Sierra.
That's a really great question that I don't have an answer to. But what I will say is, you know, Scalawag is in the process of slowing down the amount of content that we produce. We really want to become way more intentional, if you can imagine, about our connection with community, but also being able to follow up on stories. And so we will be moving from producing content almost every day to once or twice a week. And so that is something that I'm very much looking forward to. But I would say in terms of like types of coverage that I'm excited about coming up, things around labor organizing. You know, we are, of course, disappointed about the news coming out of Bessemer, Alabama, and the Amazon union, but we think that this is just the beginning. And as I've said many times before, like, you know, movements, freedom struggles, always born out of the South. Of course, labor in the South don't usually go together, but like I said, we think this is a beginning. So we're really looking forward to how we continue to see people organizing around labor in the South and covering that work.
Huge story. Sarah?
Sure. You know, we have a number of initiatives. I would say a lot of our coverage right now is around health and wealth as a result of the pandemic. So we will continue to be trying to connect our community at WURD with accurate vaccination information and resources, how to get vaccinated, and just to try and address the concerns around that, as well as you know, the challenges around recovering from the economic fallout of the pandemic. So wanting to continue to talk with small businesses and connect them up with resources and access to financial opportunities. And then, you know, we have a big DA's race coming up May 18th. And so we'll be continuing, and a big judges election. So we'll be coordinating to put together a conversation with the candidates, the DA candidates. It's very contentious. A lot of the current DA is very progressive and has a lot of pushback from the Fraternal Order of Police in Philadelphia. And so there's a big rift there. So definitely a lot of focus on that, and just continuing to talk about the increase in violence that has also spiked as a result of the pandemic in Philadelphia, mostly victims and perpetrators, young Black men. So really trying to do some violence interruption content as well around that.
Fantastic. Mitra?
So I think it's also worth noting this week that the Senate passed hate crime legislation. That was the first response to the spate of anti-Asian crimes in the country. And so we will be covering that. Our partners are certainly looking into that. This week, Kenya also went as far as saying it's not global vaccine inequity. We are in an era of vaccine apartheid. I'm working on a piece for Epicenter about that, because I always say you can't cover Queens without covering the world. And we are indeed starting to hear from immigrant families wondering if they should have their family members come to the US to get vaccines, because it's looking like months, maybe years for some countries to get it. Our partner at the Haitian Times reminds me that Haiti still has not seen any vaccines in that country. So we will be following that story. Like Philadelphia, New York is also in the midst of an election. URL Media is covering this across our partners, and we have a second part looking at law and order and the role that it's playing in this election, similar themes to Philadelphia on kind of the progressive candidate versus the moderates on this issue. You can follow these stories. Laura, I think you were trying to get us to the place of how can people read our stories. So you can follow us on Twitter at URL-media, and we compile our partner stories pretty much every day there. You can also sign up for our newsletter on our website, url-media.com, and you will see a newsletter prompt, and we would love if you signed up and you could get all these stories and more.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, you can see why I am so super excited that this show, once a month, that usually the end of the month, we're going to put the show in the hands of these marvelous people, and we will do a media sharing of the wealth coming from the entire URL network and others. So I'm going to be super excited to see what you put on the show. And I just want to remind people that we are on public television stations all around the country, including, for example, in Philadelphia, WHYY broadcasts us every Sunday at 11. There's also 5 stations in the New York area that broadcast the show. And we go out all across the country to a surprising array of places, including in the South Sierra. So you're not alone. If you know people that don't want to deal with the computer, just want to watch on the TV. Wow, yeah, I'm really excited. The next show that we have coming up is actually an interview with the incoming programming director. She came in October for PBS, the network, Sylvia Bugg, African-American woman with a great vision of the future for the network. And we talk about that at length. And then the week after that, we have Heather McGee. And the week after that, we're talking exactly about what I'm calling labor's pregnant moment and its labor pains with some of the organizers from Alabama, the Bessemer plant. Alabama, the most union concentrated part of the country, just saying. Some surprising stereotypes still persist in our media. Root them out, replace them with something better. Thank you all for joining us on today's show, on the chat. Be well, stay kind, stay curious, and don't forget to subscribe to all of us. Thanks, bye.
Thank you, Laura.